The divorce was final. Serafina stood in the center of the vast living room, a triumphant monarch surveying her newly conquered kingdom. The house, a monument of glass and cedar that Ethan had designed himself, was now hers. Every sleek line, every sun-drenched corner, every custom-built shelf was a testament to a victory she felt she had not only won, but deeply deserved. She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward a small, sad-looking cardboard box by the door. "That's the last of it, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying mixture of pity and condescension. "Your sentimental junk from the attic. I almost threw it out, but I figured you might want your grandmother's doilies or whatever else is in there." Ethan looked at the box, then at her. Her beauty was as sharp and cold as ever, framed by the expensive, artfully messy haircut she'd gotten the day before to celebrate her liberation. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a scene from a particularly well-acted but emotionally hollow play. He walked to the box and looked inside. There were a few faded photographs of his parents, a stack of letters from his university days, a tarnished silver locket. And underneath it all, rolled into a tight scroll and tied with a brittle piece of string, was a long, yellowed document. Serafina thought he was broken, a failed architect clinging to the scraps of a life she had graciously allowed him to share. She didn't know that the real treasure wasn't the house she had so desperately coveted. It was this dusty, forgotten piece of paper. Within 30 days, the foundation of her entire world would be turned to dust, and the ground beneath her feet would belong to the man she had so carelessly discarded. What she held was the title to a building, a mere structure of wood and stone. What he held was the deed to the land itself, a forgotten heirloom worth a staggering $5.7 million. We've all felt underestimated at some point in our lives, haven't we? That sting of being misjudged, of having our worth dismissed by people who only see the surface. It's a universal feeling, a quiet frustration that burns just beneath the skin. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight as we delve into Ethan's story, a story about the quiet power that lies hidden within those who are patient enough to wait for their moment. And if you believe in the eventual triumph of integrity over arrogance, make sure you click that subscribe button, because this is a journey you won't want to miss. The end had begun, as so many ends do, not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling pronouncement. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky outside bleeding from orange to indigo. Ethan had been sketching at the large oak table in his study, refining the details of a low-income housing project he was designing pro bono. Serafina had entered without knocking, her presence filling the room with the scent of expensive perfume and an unnerving silence. She didn't sit. She stood before his desk, her arms crossed, her expression a carefully constructed mask of regret that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ethan, we need to talk," she had said, the four most dreaded words in the English language. He had put down his charcoal pencil and given her his full attention, a courtesy she had long ago stopped affording him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "This isn't working anymore," she said, the words smooth and rehearsed. "I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time." She gestured vaguely around the room, at the shelves filled with his architectural books, at the framed blueprints on the wall. "This life, it isn't the one I envisioned for myself, for us." What she meant, he knew, was that it wasn't the life she envisioned for her. When they had married 10 years prior, Ethan was a rising star at a prestigious architectural firm, and she was the dazzling daughter of Marcus Thorne, a real estate mogul who moved markets with a single phone call. They were a power couple, their future a glittering skyscraper on the horizon. But 3 years ago, Ethan had walked away from the firm. He had grown disillusioned with designing opulent monuments to corporate vanity. He wanted to build things that mattered, spaces that served communities. He started his own small consultancy, a move Serafina had initially supported with feigned enthusiasm, assuming it was a brief, artistic detour before he returned to the world of lucrative contracts and high-profile clients. But the early days were a struggle. The projects were small, the pay was sporadic, and the prestige was non-existent. Serafina's patience, a commodity she possessed in very limited quantities, had evaporated. Her encouragement curdled into criticism, then into mockery. He was no longer the brilliant architect she had married. He was a foolish idealist who had traded a corner office for a dusty drafting table in their guest room. She began to see him not as a partner, but as an anchor, a dead weight dragging down her social and financial ambitions. "I want a divorce, Ethan," she said, her voice finally losing its faux sympathetic tone and hardening into something more honest. "I've already spoken to my father's lawyers. They'll be in touch. I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay, just for a little while, until we sort things out." He had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen a stranger. The woman he had loved, the one who had once marveled at his sketches and believed in his vision, was gone. In her place was a creature of pure, unadulterated ambition, her heart clad in the same designer armor as her body. He felt a profound sadness, but beneath it something else stirred, a cold, hard resolve. For the past year, while she had been attending galas and charity luncheons, bemoaning her husband's lack of drive to her coterie of equally shallow friends, he had been working. Quietly, methodically. He had nurtured a project so massive, so confidential, that he hadn't dared breathe a word of it to her, knowing she would either mock it or try to claim it. He nodded slowly, the picture of a defeated man. "I understand." Her relief was so palpable it was almost comical. She had expected a fight, tears, pleading. His calm acquiescence was a gift. "Good," she said, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. "I'm glad you're being sensible about this. It's for the best, truly." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply packed a bag, gathered his most critical work files, and walked out of the house he had poured his soul into. As he closed the door behind him, he knew he wasn't just leaving a marriage. He was walking away from the facade of his old life and stepping toward the truth of his new one. She thought she was cutting him loose. In reality, she was setting him free. And she had absolutely no idea of the storm that was gathering just over the horizon. The first official salvo in Serafina's campaign of humiliation was fired 2 weeks later at the Thorne family's Sunday dinner. It was an institution, a weekly ritual of power and judgment held at her parents' sprawling estate, a place that always felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home. Ethan had been summoned, not invited, under the pretense of discussing the divorce amicably as a family. He knew better. It was to be a public execution, a formal stripping of his status before the court of Thorne. He arrived to find them all assembled in the grand, sterile drawing room. Serafina looking radiant in white, a symbol of her newfound purity. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman whose face was a tight mask of polite disapproval. Her brother, Leo, a smirking princeling who had always viewed Ethan as a middle-class interloper. And at the center of it all, Marcus Thorne, patriarch and puppet master, seated in a leather armchair that resembled a throne. "Ethan," Marcus began, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Glad you could make it. We're all very disappointed in how things have turned out." "I am too, Marcus," Ethan replied, his voice even and calm. He refused to be baited, refused to show the anger and hurt that simmered beneath his placid exterior. Serafina let out a delicate, theatrical sigh. "Daddy, I've told you. It's for the best. We just grew apart. Our ambitions were misaligned." She looked at Ethan, her eyes full of pity. It was a masterful performance. She was the victim, the long-suffering wife finally freeing herself from a man who couldn't keep up. Leo snorted into his crystal glass of whiskey. "Misaligned is one word for it. He threw away a partnership at Sterling and Finch to draw pictures of community centers. I never understood it." "Now, Leo, that's enough," Eleanor chided gently, though her eyes agreed with her son completely. Marcus held up a hand, silencing the room. He leaned forward, adopting the tone of a benevolent king addressing a fallen courtier. Look, Ethan, what's done is done. Serafina will, of course, be keeping the house. It's her home, her security, and frankly, your earning potential at this stage, well, it's not what it once was. We want to make sure you land on your feet, for the family's sake. Appearances, you understand. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. I understand. Good, Marcus said, leaning back satisfied. I have a proposal for you. I'm opening a new logistics warehouse on the south side. I need a facility manager, someone to oversee inventory, manage the staff. It's steady work, pays a decent salary. It could be a fresh start for you, a way to build something again on a more manageable scale. The insult was breathtaking in its audacity. He was being offered a menial middle management job, a handout designed to both appease Marcus's minimal conscience and firmly establish Ethan's new, diminished place in the world. He would be an employee, a subordinate, forever indebted to the Thorne family's charity. Serafina watched him, her head tilted, a faint, curious smile on her lips. She was waiting for him to break, to either lash out in anger or grovel in gratitude. Ethan took a slow breath. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the primal urge to unleash the torrent of furious words he held in reserve. But he didn't. Instead, he thought of the project. He thought of the intricate network of contracts, the silent partnerships, the billions of dollars in play that these arrogant, blind people knew nothing about. He felt his phone in his pocket, a cool, solid weight against his leg. On it were the final renderings of the Thorn Creek redevelopment, a project that would reshape the entire city, a project of which he was the lead architect and a primary stakeholder. The irony of the name was a private, bitter pleasure. He met Marcus's gaze directly. That's a very generous offer, Marcus, he said, his voice imbued with a quiet dignity that seemed to confuse them. But I have to decline. I'm quite committed to the path I'm on. A flicker of annoyance crossed Marcus's face. Leo scoffed openly. Committed to what? Being broke? Don't be a fool, Ethan. Take the charity. It's not charity, Leo. It's an offer of employment, and I'm declining it, Ethan said, his focus still on Marcus. But I do appreciate you thinking of me. Serafina finally spoke, her voice laced with exasperation. Oh, for heaven's sake, Ethan, stop being so proud. What are you going to do? You have no firm, no clients to speak of. My father is trying to help you. I know he is, Ethan said, standing up, and I'm grateful for the thought. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an early meeting tomorrow. He walked out of the room, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. They didn't understand his calm. They interpreted it as the foolish, stubborn pride of a broken man. They couldn't conceive of a reality where he didn't need them, where their offer was not an act of magnanimity, but a pathetic, misjudged insult. As he drove away from the oppressive grandeur of the Thorne estate, Ethan allowed himself a small, grim smile. The first chess piece had been moved. They thought they were playing checkers, but he was engaged in a much longer, more complex game. They had just revealed their strategy, and it was exactly as predictable as he had anticipated. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but it was also fuel. It clarified his purpose and solidified his resolve. They had drawn their lines in the sand. Soon he would show them that he owned the entire beach. The legal proceedings were less a negotiation and more a systematic dismantling of his life. Serafina, armed with the city's most ruthless divorce attorney, a shark named Victoria Sterling, who ironically shared a name with Ethan's old firm, went for the jugular. They painted a picture of Ethan as an unstable, unreliable dreamer who had squandered his potential and forced Serafina to endure years of financial and emotional neglect. It was a masterpiece of fiction, delivered with the solemn gravity of gospel truth. Ethan sat at the opposing table in the sterile conference room, a lone figure against their corporate might. He had chosen to represent himself, a decision that caused a ripple of amusement and pity. To them, it was the ultimate sign of his destitution. He couldn't even afford a lawyer. The truth was far simpler. He didn't need one. The material possessions they were fighting over were, to him, meaningless distractions. There was only one thing he truly needed to secure, and it was something they considered worthless. Victoria Sterling, a woman with a razor-sharp bob and eyes that seemed to calculate misery in billable hours, laid out their terms. Miss Thorne will be taking full possession of the marital home and its contents, she stated, her voice flat and final. Given her significant financial contributions to the marriage, both direct and through her family support, and Mr. Mark's diminished earning capacity, we feel this is more than equitable. Ethan just nodded. Okay. Victoria paused, momentarily thrown by his lack of resistance. She will also retain ownership of the Mercedes and the Range Rover. Fine, Ethan said. She is also petitioning for a significant portion of your remaining savings to compensate for the career opportunities she forewent in support of your earlier endeavors. This was the most audacious lie of all. Serafina had never worked a day in her life. Her career consisted of managing the household staff and organizing social events. But Ethan didn't flinch. I can agree to that. Serafina, sitting beside her lawyer, watched him with a mixture of triumph and contempt. She couldn't believe how easy it was. He was crumbling, just as she'd predicted. He was a hollow man, and she was scooping out the last of the contents. Is there anything, Victoria asked, a smirk playing on her lips, that you wish to contest, Mr. Marks? Ethan leaned forward slightly. Just one thing, my personal effects. There's a box of old papers and photographs in the attic. My father's letters, things from my grandparents. I'd like that box. Victoria and Serafina exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. He was fighting for scraps, for sentimental rubbish. It was pathetic. We can certainly allow you your mementos, Victoria said, barely suppressing a laugh. I'll add a clause stipulating that you will be allowed to retrieve one cardboard box of personal ephemera. The formal absurdity of the legal language was the final twist of the knife. Ethan signed the agreement without another word. He was officially a man with nothing but a box of memories. 2 weeks later, Serafina threw a party. It was billed as a housewarming, a darkly humorous title for celebrating the acquisition of a house she had lived in for a decade. The entire social elite of the city was there, swarming through the rooms Ethan had designed, drinking champagne and gossiping about his spectacular fall from grace. He wasn't there, of course, but his presence lingered like a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in gilded corners. I'm just so relieved, Serafina was heard saying to a group of friends, her voice carrying across the open-plan living area. It's like a weight has been lifted. I can finally breathe again. I feel so free. Marcus Thorne stood by the massive fireplace, a proud father surveying his daughter's victory. He clapped a fellow developer on the back. She's a strong girl, my Serafina. She knows what she wants. Sometimes you have to cut away the dead wood to let the tree grow. The metaphor was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. Ethan was the dead wood. Meanwhile, miles away, in a small, sparsely furnished apartment that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, Ethan was at work. The space was the polar opposite of the house he'd left behind. It was functional, efficient, stripped of all pretense. On his large, clean desk, under the bright glow of an architect's lamp, were not sentimental letters, but blueprints, financial projections, and zoning applications. This was his real home, his true kingdom. He was on a video call with Julian Vance, a seasoned developer with a reputation for integrity and visionary thinking. Julian was Ethan's partner, the financial muscle behind his architectural genius. They were the two-man force behind the Thorn Creek project, a secret they had guarded for over a year. The final environmental impact report came back clean, Julian said. his face beaming from the laptop screen. The city council is green-lighting the zoning variance. We have the final go-ahead, my friend. All systems are go. Ethan felt a surge of quiet, profound satisfaction. And the land acquisition? All parcels secured and accounted for, Julian confirmed, except for the last, most crucial piece of the puzzle, the 10-acre Thorn Grant plot. Ethan smiled. Don't worry about that one, Julian. I'm handling that personally. You could say it's a family matter. He ended the call and walked to the window of his small apartment. He looked out over the city, a glittering tapestry of lights. They all thought he was finished, a man adrift in the ruins of his life. They saw a small apartment and assumed it was a symbol of his failure. They didn't understand that for a man like Ethan, a builder, this wasn't an ending. It was a foundation. And from this foundation, he was about to build an empire, right on the land they thought they had stolen from him. The party at his old house would be the last celebration Serafina would enjoy for a very long time. The final act of the charade was orchestrated by Serafina herself. A month after the divorce was finalized, her assistant called Ethan with a summons. There was one last document, a minor transfer addendum, that required his signature. It was a trivial piece of paperwork, something that could have been handled by a courier, but Serafina insisted he come to the house. It was a power play, a final opportunity to rub his nose in her victory. When he arrived, the transformation was already underway. The warm, personal touches that had made it a home were gone. In their place were cold, abstract sculptures and oversized coffee table books about fashion designers. His favorite armchair had been replaced by a severe-looking chaise lounge that seemed designed for posing rather than sitting. It was no longer a space for living. It was a showroom for a life of curated emptiness. Serafina kept him waiting for 10 minutes before sweeping into the room, a file folder in her hand. She didn't offer him a seat or a glass of water. She was the busy, important homeowner, and he was an inconvenient errand. Ethan, she said, her tone brisk. Thanks for coming. Just need you to sign this at the bottom. She tossed the folder onto the cold marble island in the kitchen. He didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he let his gaze drift around the room, lingering on the high, vaulted ceilings and the way the afternoon light poured through the clerestory windows he had so carefully placed. He remembered sketching this very room on a cocktail napkin during their honeymoon in Italy, full of hope and a love he believed was as solid as concrete. A wave of genuine sadness washed over him, not for the woman standing impatiently before him, but for the dream that had died within these walls. He had mourned the marriage already. Now he was mourning the architecture, the physical manifestation of a promise that had been broken. It's amazing what you've done with the place, he said, his voice quiet. She mistook his melancholy for envy. Yes, I'm finally making it my own, getting rid of the clutter. The implication was clear. He was the clutter. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. She was so confident, so utterly convinced of her own superiority. It was like watching someone dance on the edge of a cliff, completely oblivious to the abyss yawning at their feet. This was the moment, the quiet before the storm. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the ambient sounds of the house fading into a low hum. He reached into the simple leather satchel he was carrying and pulled out an envelope. It was crisp and white, a stark contrast to the flimsy document she had thrown on the counter. You look well, Serafina, he said, his voice calm and measured. It was this calm that always unnerved her. It was a language she didn't speak. Busy, I imagine, building your new life. I am, she said, tapping her fingers impatiently on the marble. Which is why I need you to sign this so I can get on with my day. Some of us have important things to do. She delivered the line with a final, devastating flourish of condescension. I do hope you find some purpose, Ethan. Maybe you can manage a coffee shop or something. It would suit your smaller ambitions. He let the insult hang in the air, letting its ugliness be fully appreciated. He didn't react. He didn't defend himself. He simply absorbed it, the last piece of data he needed. He pushed the envelope he was holding gently across the counter toward her. "Before I sign anything," he said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational whisper, "there's a small matter of ownership we need to discuss." A frown creased her perfectly smooth forehead. "Ownership? What are you talking about? The house is mine. The court's decided. The papers are signed. It's over." "You're right," Ethan said, his gaze as steady as a rock. "It is over." He nodded toward the envelope. "But not in the way you think." She looked from his face to the envelope, a flicker of uncertainty finally entering her eyes. She had been so sure of her victory, so certain of his defeat, that the idea of a complication was not just unwelcome, it was inconceivable. The queen was on her throne, the peasant at her feet. What could he possibly do? But there was something in his stillness, in the unnerving quiet of his demeanor, that sent a tiny, cold shiver down her spine. The air was still. The storm was about to break. Serafina's confusion curdled into annoyance. "Stop being so dramatic, Ethan. Whatever this is, I'm not interested. Sign the paper." Ethan didn't move. He simply looked at her, his expression a quiet, devastating calm. He then reached into his satchel again and pulled out the rolled-up scroll from the cardboard box, the brittle string still tied around its middle. He placed it on the counter next to the modern, crisp envelope. The contrast between the ancient, yellowed parchment and the pristine white paper was stark. "The court gave you the house, Serafina. That's absolutely correct," he began, his voice as soft and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "But a court can only grant ownership of an asset that is part of the marital estate. And the interesting thing is, while the house was, the land it is built on was not." He gently slid the old scroll across the marble. "You called this sentimental junk. You laughed when I asked for it. This was in that box." Serafina stared at the document, her brow furrowed. "What is that? Some kind of pirate map? This is absurd. The house is on a half-acre lot in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Of course we own the land." "No," Ethan corrected gently. "You assumed we owned the land. Your father's lawyers assumed we owned the land. Everyone assumed, but they were all wrong." He began to pace slowly, his footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous room. He wasn't angry, he was something far more terrifying. He was a lecturer, a historian, and a judge, all rolled into one. He was delivering his list of grievances, not as accusations, but as simple, undeniable facts. "I remember our first Christmas in this house," he started, his voice distant. "You told me my dream of starting my own firm was quaint. That was the first crack in the foundation." He stopped and looked at a minimalist painting she had hung. "I remember the dinner party where you introduced me to your friends as an architect who is currently between projects. You made it sound like I was unemployed, not that I was pouring my life savings into building our own company." He turned back to her. "I remember the night I showed you the preliminary designs for the Community Arts Center, the pro bono project. You glanced at it for 5 seconds and said, 'That's nice, dear,' before changing the subject to a charity gala you were planning. You didn't see the work. You didn't see the passion. You just saw something that didn't come with a commission." His voice remained even, but each sentence landed with the weight of a hammer blow. This wasn't a plea for sympathy, it was a closing argument. "I remember sitting in that conference room with you and your piranha of a lawyer, and the way you both smirked when I asked for a box of old papers. As if a man's history, his connection to his family, was a joke, an object of pity." He finally came to a stop in front of her, his eyes locking onto hers. The pity was gone from her face, replaced by a growing, horrified understanding. "You and your family," he said, the words now sharp and clear, "you worship wealth. You value status, appearances, and power. You judged my worth based on the balance of a bank account you could see, and you found me lacking. You dismissed me. You humiliated me. You cast me aside because you thought I was worthless. He tapped the ancient scroll with one finger. But you never bothered to look deeper. You never considered that true value, like a strong foundation, is often buried, hidden from view. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a quiet bomb that would shatter her world. You have the house, Serafina. Congratulations. It's a beautiful structure. But I have the deed to the land. And not just this half-acre lot, the original, undivided 10-acre plot that this entire neighborhood was built on. The full, devastating revelation hung in the air between them. Serafina's face, which had been a mask of arrogant triumph only moments before, had gone completely slack. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The gears of her mind were grinding, trying to process a piece of information so antithetical to her reality that it simply wouldn't compute. That's impossible, she finally stammered, the words barely audible. That's a crazy story. A piece of old paper? It means nothing. It's a fantasy. Ethan shook his head slowly, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes. It's not a story, Serafina. It's history. He gestured to the pristine white envelope he had brought. And this is the future. He opened the envelope and slid out a sheaf of documents. They were thick, official, covered in seals and signatures. One was a detailed geological survey. Another was a municipal zoning proposal. A third was a corporate prospectus, its cover emblazoned with a sleek, modern logo. This dusty old paper, Ethan explained, his voice returning to its calm, instructional tone, is the original land grant deed given to my great-great-grandfather, Phineas Marks, in 1888. He was one of this city's first surveyors. He leased the land to a development company in the 1920s. They were supposed to build a rail yard, but the deal fell through and they pivoted to residential housing in the 50s, creating this lovely, exclusive neighborhood. He paused, letting the information sink in. Here's the part their lawyers missed, the part everyone forgot about over the decades. They built on leased land. The master lease had a 99-year term, set to expire in the 21st century. Upon expiry, if the lease wasn't renegotiated by the developer's successor corporation, which went bankrupt in 1987, the land and all non-removable improvements would revert to the deed holder or their legal heir, me. He tapped the documents again. The lease expired 3 months ago. I am now the legal, undisputed owner of this entire 10-acre parcel. Your house, your neighbors' houses, they're all technically trespassing on my property. Serafina's face was ashen. The blood had drained from it, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. No, she whispered. It was a prayer, a desperate plea to an uncaring universe. As if on cue, the doorbell chimed, a crisp, clear sound that sliced through the suffocating tension in the room. Serafina jumped, startled. Ethan didn't even flinch. That will be my partner, he said calmly. He walked to the door and opened it to reveal a man in a perfectly tailored Italian suit. He was handsome, radiating an aura of power and confidence that even Marcus Thorne would have envied. It was Julian Vance. Julian strode into the room, his eyes scanning the space with a professional, appraising gaze. He completely ignored the shell-shocked Serafina, who seemed to have shrunk into herself. He walked directly to Ethan and clapped him warmly on the shoulder. "Ethan, my friend," Julian said, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "I just came from the capital investment meeting. The board didn't just approve the final budget, they increased it. We are officially greenlit for a $1.2 billion injection for the Thorn Creek redevelopment project." He grinned. "Congratulations. You're about to become the most talked-about architect in the country." Julian glanced at the documents on the counter, then finally acknowledged Serafina's presence with a dismissive nod. "I see you're handling the final acquisition." The name of the project, Thorn Creek, was the final, exquisitely cruel detail. It was a name that would forever link her family's legacy to their own spectacular downfall, orchestrated by the very man they had cast out. Ethan turned back to his ex-wife. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. He was the king, and she was the peasant, standing in a house that was no longer a castle, but a cage. "The house is a structure, Serafina," he said, his voice devoid of all malice, stating it like a simple mathematical fact. "An asset with a depreciating value of, let's be generous, $1.5 million. But the land underneath it, as the cornerstone of the Thorn Creek development, has been appraised and valued for acquisition by our partners at $5.7 million. He paused, letting the number, the impossible, life-altering number, land in the silent room. "You own the house," he concluded. "I own the ground it stands on. Per the terms of the reversion clause and the municipal demolition permits we've already secured, you have 30 days to move the structure. After that, we break ground." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, a sound. A choked, strangled gasp escaped Serafina's throat. Her carefully constructed world, her entire identity, had been demolished in the space of 5 minutes by a quiet man and a dusty piece of paper. The reversal was complete. The underestimated hero had revealed his power, and the arrogant elite was left standing in the rubble. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos. Serafina's composure, the icy reserve that had been her armor for so long, shattered into a million pieces. The first stage was denial, a frantic, high-pitched insistence that this was a trick, a cruel joke. "You're lying," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is insane. You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll sue you for everything." Julian Vance, who had been observing the scene with the detached interest of a biologist studying an insect, finally spoke. "I wouldn't recommend that, ma'am," he said coolly. "Our legal team is the best in the country. They've spent 6 months verifying every single clause of the reversion. Mr. Marks's claim is not just valid, it's ironclad. Any legal challenge would be financially ruinous for you." Her eyes darted between Ethan and Julian, searching for a crack in their unified front. Finding none, she moved to the second stage. Rage. A primal scream of fury tore from her throat. She lunged for the documents on the counter, but Julian, with surprising speed, intercepted her, placing a firm hand on her arm. "Don't," he said, his voice low and commanding. Defeated, she crumpled. The rage dissolved into desperate, pleading sobs. This was the part Ethan had dreaded. The humiliation of his enemy gave him no joy. He had wanted justice, not destruction. But he knew this display was not genuine remorse. It was the terror of loss. "Ethan, please," she wept, the tears carving paths through her expensive makeup. "Please don't do this. This is my home. It's everything I have." "No, it's not," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's a house. You have your family, your friends. You have the money from my savings account." Her face fell. She had forgotten about that, about the money she had so ruthlessly taken. The memory of her own greed hung in the air, a testament to her character. Her tears slowed. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling. She was calling in her cavalry. She was calling her father. Marcus Thorne arrived 20 minutes later, flanked by his personal lawyer, a grim-faced man named Peterson. Marcus was a storm front of condensed fury, his face flushed, his eyes promising retribution. He strode into the room, completely ignoring his weeping daughter, and pointed a trembling finger at Ethan. "What is the meaning of this, Marks?" he roared. "What is this fantasy you're spinning? Are you trying to blackmail my daughter? Because I will crush you. I will bury you so deep in litigation you'll never see the light of day again." Ethan didn't respond. He simply gestured for Peterson, the lawyer, to examine the documents laid out on the counter. The original deed, the reversion clause analysis, the new zoning permits, and the Thorn Creek prospectus. Peterson, unlike his blustering client, was a professional. He picked up the ancient deed with a careful reverence, his eyes scanning the faded script. He then moved to the legal analysis, his expression growing more and more grim with each page he turned. He spent nearly 15 minutes in complete silence, absorbing the unassailable logic of Ethan's position. Marcus paced back and forth, fuming, while Serafina watched the lawyer's face, her last hope dwindling with every passing second. Finally, Peterson put the papers down and took off his glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. He looked at Marcus, his face pale. "Marcus," he said quietly, "we have a problem." "What do you mean, we have a problem?" Marcus snapped. "Fix it. That's what I pay you for." "There's nothing to fix," Peterson replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "He's right. The title search our firm did for the divorce was for the property parcel as it's currently defined by the city. We never went back to the original land grants. Nobody has in 70 years. The reversion clause is real. The chain of title from his ancestor to him is clean. Your daughter, she owns the building. A prefabricated structure that the contract explicitly defines as a movable improvement. Mr. Marks owns the land." The words landed in the room with the finality of a judge's gavel. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built an empire on real estate, on the very concept of owning land, looked as if he'd been physically struck. He stared at Ethan, his rage now replaced by a dawning, horrified respect. Ethan met his gaze. He felt no triumph, only a quiet, somber vindication. "You taught me a valuable lesson once, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the silent room. He was repeating words Marcus had said to him at a dinner years ago, a piece of advice delivered with patronizing arrogance. "You told me that a man's worth isn't in his salary, it's in what he builds and what he owns. You said, 'Don't work for the man, be the man.' I took that to heart." The inverted wisdom, the parallel structure of the moment, hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. He had created this. His own cutthroat philosophy, his own condescending lessons, had been used to engineer his family's downfall. He looked at Ethan, no longer seeing the failed, idealistic son-in-law, but a master strategist, a silent predator who had been watching, waiting, and learning from them the entire time. The game was over. Checkmate. The fallout was swift and brutal. In the rarefied air of Serafina's social circle, status was everything, and the perception of weakness was a death sentence. The story, too spectacular to be contained, spread like wildfire. At first it was whispered gossip at cocktail parties. Then it became the headline story in the city's business journal. The tale of the arrogant heiress and the quiet architect she'd underestimated was irresistible. Serafina, who had built her entire identity on being Mrs. Thornmarks, the queen of her magnificent castle, became a tragic, almost comical figure overnight. Her friends, the same women who had sipped champagne at her liberation party, now avoided her calls. To be associated with her was to be associated with a colossal, embarrassing failure of judgment. She was no longer a power player, she was the punchline to a citywide joke. The 30-day deadline to move the house was, of course, an absurdity. The cost of lifting and transporting a structure of that size and complexity was astronomical, far beyond her means now that her access to Ethan's hidden wealth and her father's full support had been severed. She was forced to abandon it. On the 30th day, Ethan and Julian stood on a nearby hill and watched as a demolition crew began the careful work of dismantling the house he had once called home. He felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by the sense of a new beginning. He wasn't destroying the past, he was clearing the ground for the future. Serafina was forced to move into a generic two-bedroom apartment in a modern high-rise, the kind of place she once would have derisively called a starter home. It was clean, comfortable, and utterly devoid of the character and prestige she craved. Her life was reduced to a scale she found humiliating. The vast emptiness of her days was no longer filled with social events and shopping sprees, but with the quiet, nagging reality of her own choices. Her father, Marcus Thorne, faced a different kind of reckoning. His reputation had been damaged, but more importantly, his business interests were now directly impacted. The Thorn Creek project was no mere housing development. It was a massive, multi-billion-dollar urban renewal initiative that would create a new commercial and residential hub in the city. Ethan and Julian's company was now one of the most powerful players in the regional market, and Marcus was on the outside looking in. He was a pragmatist above all else. After weeks of fuming and plotting futile legal challenges, he accepted the reality of his situation. He could either become an enemy of the most significant development project in a generation, or he could find a way to be a part of it. He swallowed his pride, a bitter pill that must have felt like swallowing glass, and requested a meeting with Ethan. They met not in a boardroom or a fancy restaurant, but in Ethan's sparse, functional apartment. The choice of venue was deliberate. Ethan was not going to play on Marcus's home turf. This time, the meeting was on his terms. Marcus arrived alone, without his lawyer. He looked older, diminished. The swagger was gone, replaced by a grudging, weary pragmatism. "Ethan," he began, foregoing any pleasantries, "what you've done, it's either madness or genius." "It's just business, Marcus," Ethan replied, echoing a phrase Marcus himself had used countless times to justify his own ruthless decisions. "I want in," Marcus said, the words costing him dearly. "I want to invest. Thorne Corporation has the capital and the political connections to accelerate your timeline by years. A partnership would be mutually beneficial." Ethan listened, his expression neutral. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He could have slammed the door in Marcus's face, savoring the revenge. But his goal was never just to punish, it was to build. And Marcus, for all his flaws, was a formidable builder. More importantly, Ethan saw an opportunity for a different kind of justice. "A partnership is a possibility," Ethan said slowly, letting the hope hang in the air. "But it would come with conditions, not financial conditions, moral ones." Marcus looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that redemption requires more than just a checkbook, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Any business relationship between us would be contingent on two things. First, a full, public apology from you, on behalf of your family, for the treatment I received. Not a quiet statement, but a press conference. I want the world to see that you acknowledge the truth of what happened." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't refuse. "Second," Ethan continued, "Thorne Corporation will make a foundational, multi-million-dollar donation to a new charitable trust I'm establishing. It will fund architectural scholarships and build community centers in underserved neighborhoods. The very things your family mocked me for." The terms were clear. The price for Marcus to get back in the game was not money, but humility. He would have to publicly atone for his arrogance and invest in the very ideals he had scorned. Ethan watched him, waiting. The choice was his. He could cling to his pride and fade into irrelevance, or he could bend the knee and, in doing so, salvage a piece of his legacy. The silent enabler was finally being forced to make a choice between his pride and his future. 6 months passed. The seasons turned. Where the house of glass and cedar once stood, a place of broken dreams and bitter memories, there was now the burgeoning framework of something new. The foundations had been laid for the Thorn Creek Park, a stunning expanse of green space, public art, and community pavilions that would serve as the heart of Ethan's visionary development project. Ethan walked the site daily, his hard hat on, his old satchel full of blueprints slung over his shoulder. He was no longer the quiet, underestimated man who faded into the background. He was the driving force behind a new city landmark, his name spoken with respect and awe in boardrooms and on construction sites. He moved with a newfound confidence, not the arrogant swagger of a Marcus Thorne, but the quiet, deep-seated assurance of a man who knows his own worth, because he has built it with his own hands and his own mind. The news of Marcus Thorne's press conference had been the talk of the town. Standing before a bank of cameras, he had looked tired but resolute. He read from a prepared statement, his voice stiff but clear. He offered a full and unequivocal apology to Ethan Marks for his family's profound misjudgment and deeply disrespectful treatment. He then announced a $10 million foundational grant from the Thorne Corporation to the newly established Marks Foundation for Community Architecture. It was a masterful move of public relations, a business decision born of desperation, but it was also the pound of flesh Ethan had demanded. It was public contrition. A professional, though pointedly not personal relationship, was forged from the ashes of their conflict. Marcus became a silent partner, his capital fueling the project, his pride a constant, unspoken reminder of the price of his redemption. Serafina's fate was quieter, sadder, and more poetic. The money she had taken from Ethan's savings eventually ran out, spent on maintaining a lifestyle she could no longer afford. She was forced to take a job, her first real one, as an assistant manager at a high-end boutique, a position where she was now the one catering to the whims of wealthy, demanding women like the one she used to be. The irony was not lost on her. She tried to contact Ethan several times. The first few calls were angry and accusatory. The next were tearful and pleading. The last were strangely pragmatic, hinting at a desire to reconnect, which Ethan rightly interpreted as a desperate attempt to get back into his orbit, to reclaim some semblance of her former life. He never answered. He had blocked her number. It wasn't an act of cruelty, but one of self-preservation. He had moved on. Her chapter was closed. The narrative made it clear that her circumstances had changed, but she had not. She hadn't learned from her mistakes, only from her losses. There was to be no easy, unearned redemption for her. One crisp autumn evening, Ethan stood on the highest point of the new park, a gentle hill that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The demolition of the other houses on the 10-acre plot was complete, the families having been bought out at prices so generous they were life-changing. The entire parcel of land was now a canvas, and he was the artist. He watched as the construction lights flickered on below, illuminating the skeletons of new buildings, the promise of homes, offices, and community spaces. He thought of the journey, the humiliation, the quiet anger, the methodical planning. He felt a sense of profound peace. The victory wasn't the money, though the financial security was a welcome tool. It wasn't the revenge, which had proven to be a hollow and fleeting satisfaction. The true victory was this: the freedom to create, the power to turn a place of personal pain into a source of public joy. The final resolution wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet moment of reflection. Ethan was walking through the nearly completed Thorn Creek Park. The last of the sod had been laid, the saplings were taking root, and the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings filled the air. The setting sun cast long, warm shadows across the winding pathways, illuminating the bronze plaque at the park's entrance. Donated to the people of this city by the Marks Foundation. May this be a place where community is built and dreams find a home. He sat on a simple wooden bench, a bench he himself had designed, and looked out over the city. It was the same view he'd had from his small apartment window, but now it felt different. It was no longer a distant goal, but a present reality. He was not defined by the battle he had won, but by what he had chosen to build in its wake. He had taken the ugliest parts of his past, the betrayal, the humiliation, and used them as compost to grow something beautiful and enduring. The narrator's voice, which had guided us through the drama, now settles into a tone of quiet wisdom. True worth, it seems to say, is not something that can be conferred by others, or measured in square footage or bank balances. It is not found in the labels you wear or the car you drive. True worth is intrinsic. It's forged in the fires of integrity, built on a foundation of character, and expressed through the quiet dignity with which one navigates the world. Serafina and her family had judged by the glittering, fragile surface of things, and in the end, they were left with nothing of substance. Ethan, in his quiet patience, had focused on the unseen, the structural, the essential. In doing so, he had gained more than just a fortune. He had reclaimed his soul and built a legacy. The ultimate triumph wasn't in proving his enemies wrong. It was in proving himself right. He had believed in a different kind of success, a different measure of a man, and he had held fast to that belief even when the world told him he was a fool. The satisfaction came not from their downfall, but from his own quiet, unassailable ascent. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding the most valuable cards. They don't need to shout their worth because they are busy building it. What do you think is the most important kind of strength? The one that is displayed for all to see, or the one that is held quietly in reserve? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and insights are what make this community so special. And if you found this story of justice and vindication as satisfying as I did, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content that celebrates the enduring power of the human spirit. Because at the end of the day, everyone deserves to see integrity win.